Amat merat ike tesolderat igmerut.
So, as you can probably see from the other videos, the question of whether virtue is knowledge is a complicated one, and one that is not as simple as may seem upon first inquiry. So, what can we say after this brief inquiry? We began by looking at various definitions, beginning with works like the Meno and working through to recent definitions. One thing we found in common with them all is that virtue involves behaving in a way that a virtuous person would behave. This involves some kind of knowledge, at least. The knowledge is the knowledge of how a virtuous person would behave when confronted with particular circumstances. How would a virtuous person behave, though? A brief investigation of the Aristotelian account was examined in order to give some idea of the complicated nature of behaving as a virtuous person would. As could be seen from that investigation, this is more complicated than simply copying the behavior of someone that is considered virtuous. While this may be a good start to understanding how a virtuous person behaves, it is not enough to simply behave as the virtuous person would. Being virtuous and applying the virtues involves more contemplation and exists at a more intellectual level. While consequentialism involves knowing the outcome and assessing an agent's action according to that outcome, virtue is more complicated. Virtue, like a deontological view, involves more understanding and knowledge, though again it is slightly more complicated than a deontological view as well. In a deontological account, one could, for the most part, get away with knowing what our duties are and applying those duties. So there is at least some basic cognitive element to it. However, with virtue, the cognitive element goes deeper. Simply applying how we have seen a virtuous person behave previously will not be enough to be considered virtuous. As can be seen from the Aristotelian account, one must know why their action is the right action. One must know and understand what virtue or virtues apply in the particular situation and why they apply. The agent must be able to perceive the situation in the correct way and apply the appropriate response. This is what Aristotle refers to as practical wisdom. The agent that is in possession of practical wisdom is the agent that has good moral judgment. To have practical wisdom is to be good at thinking about how to live a fulfilled and worthwhile life. It is a kind of intellectual skill. It is a species of understanding and a species of knowledge. However, is this enough to call it knowledge? As we saw from the final section, Plato argued that this was not enough to call it knowledge. Something we'll review shortly. For now, though, if we consider practical wisdom to be a different form of knowledge than a stricter form of knowledge in the justified true belief sense, it seems we could call virtue knowledge. We also explored an objection to virtue as knowledge in the form of Driver's argument that some of the virtues rely on an epistemic defect in order to apply them successfully. While Driver made several arguments, we explored only one, her criticism of modesty. Driver argued that being modest involved underestimating one's own ability and achievements, and not fully understanding them. Therefore, being ignorant of certain elements of our own abilities and achievements. Winter's discussion of Driver's criticisms was then used to explore Driver's criticisms. Winter's own account of modesty was then used to show that Driver had not successfully challenged the idea that modesty is a form of virtue, and instead showed that modesty was in fact a form of honesty, and involved knowing not just our own achievements, but the circumstances that enabled us to make those achievements, showing us that modesty is not a form of epistemic defect. However, the next challenge to the idea that virtue is knowledge is not one that is so easy to dismiss. This came in the form of Plato's dialogue Meno. In the Meno, Socrates argued both that virtue is knowledge and that it is not. Virtue is instead a form of true opinion. His argument began with the idea that there is indeed some component of knowledge to virtue, but that it alone is not knowledge. It is necessary for virtue, but not sufficient. There is a non-cognitive element to it as well. However, Socrates argues that it is the knowledge component that makes it beneficial. So whenever we see virtue being beneficial, then we see an application of knowledge. Socrates then argued that the fact that there were no teachers and no students of virtues, then it could not be declared knowledge, for knowledge is something that is teachable. We can, at best, call it true opinion, with Socrates arguing that as long as that opinion is true, then it can no less guide us than actual knowledge, which he explains using the example of someone with an opinion giving correct directions to a place that they had never been. If the directions of the one with the true opinion get us there the same as the one with knowledge gets us there, then the guidance is no less useful. However, with no ability to teach virtue and no one to teach virtue, it cannot be considered knowledge, even if knowledge composes a part of it. Is this enough to declare that virtue is indeed true opinion only? Well, Socrates admits that a part of virtue, at least, is composed of knowledge. There is a cognitive element to virtue, even if there is a non-cognitive element also. Socrates also admits that virtue can only be beneficial when coupled with knowledge. This is something that the Aristotelian account overlaps with. One may behave in a manner that looks virtuous, but without the understanding of why one is behaving that way, then one cannot be considered to be acting virtuously. If we also consider the level of intellectual skill necessary for working out which virtue applies, how to apply it in that particular situation, what the appropriate response would be when applying the virtue, what the correct mean is, and more, then we can see that it is a form of practical wisdom, at least as Aristotle describes practical wisdom. The question then becomes, is practical wisdom the same as knowledge? With the level of intellectual skill needed to successfully apply the virtues as given by the Aristotelian account, and the level of understanding necessary, one should consider it a form of knowledge. It is, as Aristotle argues, a form of understanding what it means to live a fulfilled life. There is a level of understanding that goes beyond mere reaction. While it may not be a strict form of knowledge in the epistemological sense, such as conforming to some proposition, it is a form of knowledge in how to behave in a manner that allows one to live a fulfilled life. It is a form of knowledge that allows one to react properly in particular situations, and it involves a level of cognition that goes beyond simply reacting. This should be sufficient to call it knowledge, just in the form of arete rather than techni.